Corsair Clockworks, Chapter 5, in which Andrea joins the war. There was light and a softness beneath Andrea. Reality began to form around her. First, the feel of blankets beneath her fingers, and a pillow under her head. A smell, alcohol, tonic, and herbs. Then slowly sound, conversation through walls, rigid footsteps, thumping, and the barking of orders. And much closer, there were voices.
"Lucky this is the worst you got, Mr. Ronan."
"I'm fine." "Oh, of course. That explains the blood." Both of these voices were familiar, and were what caused Andrea to stir. Groggily she opened her eyes, and she found herself in an unknown room. Everything from a few feet on appeared gradually more indistinct. Oh, she didn't have her glasses on. But she discerned that she was resting on a bed with white sheets, in a room with 2 rows of such beds. An infirmary? Yes, it explained the smell, coming from a set of shelves and cabinets on the opposite side of the room. It was still daylight, as sunlight drifted from a single window behind her. 2 figures sat on chairs nearby, the owners of the voices. "Don't expect a thank you for this," the younger of the 2 said coldly. "I could have done this myself." I know," the first said, more amused than anything. "Master Ferris did everything in his power to make you self-reliant." A pause, a heavy one. "He was a fine master to have. My condolences. For that at least. Thank you." She knew these voices. As the last of sleep finally cleared from her eyes, she saw the young magus seated upright on a stool. Perched on one of the higher shelves on the wall was his familiar, Pascal the Hawk. The young journeyman's shirt was off, and another mage held a wand near a wrapped wound on his right side. A whitish glow surrounded the wand, but after seeing so much spectacular incantations earlier, it barely registered to Andrea. She was more concerned with the man holding said stick, a man with a long nose and a self-satisfied grin visible through strands of long, shaggy black hair. He dressed head to toe in black, and in the corner of the room a bright green snake lay coiled in sleep. "Master Nicholas!" Andrea blurted, dragging herself to a sitting position. The younger magus started at her outburst, while Nicholas smiled wider and cheerfully waved at her. "Miss Corsair, a pleasure to see you awake. The shock has worn off, then?" The younger man blushed deeply and stared off in another direction, and Andrea let out a small sound as she realized why. Despite her relief at seeing Nicholas, and indeed, seeing the young mage alive, he was half naked. She spun around and faced the window, sitting straight and tall. Goodness, it seemed the expectation of doughy magic users wasn't uniformly true. The man was lean, and she had clearly seen curves of muscle around his arms and lining his chest. Nicholas chuckled at the both of them and spoke to his younger. "And there we go. You could take those bandages off. Your shirt is clean, by the way." "Master, you know this girl?" "But of course," he replied warmly. She heard him stand and approach her. "You can turn now, Miss Corsair, and these are yours." Still a bit flustered, she moved and saw that Nicholas held her glasses. She smiled and sighed in relief. Thank you." "And how are you faring?" I'm still trembling," she admitted shyly as she put on her glasses. "Where are we?" "The city guard was kind enough to allow us space in the infirmary," he informed her, "considering what you've both been through." The events of the morning, she hoped that was only afternoon sun in the window and not much later, began to solidify in her mind. She had never come so close to death in her entire life, nor had she seen such intent of violence in the eyes of another human being. No, those men had been something other than men, surely. Did those men escape? Nicholas provided, tapping his lower lip with his fingertips. "Yes, but they won't get far." No, she attempted to correct herself. "The message, they didn't get—" Strange considering Nicholas, her answer was silence. His eyes swiveled to face her, layers of deep thought hidden in them. "Why don't you do something about your hair, dear? You're a bit of a mess." Embarrassed, Andrea raised a hand to her hair. Nearly all of it was out of the style the ladies at the boutique had given her. She must have looked a mess indeed. She let down her locks and began to comb and reset it as Nicholas turned away and rested his hands behind his back. "This concerns both of you. You'll want to stay, Mr. Ronan," Nicholas began in a steady voice. "First off, this is Andrea Corsair. Andrea, this is apprentice Monty Ronan." Her hair properly adjusted, Andrea slowly lowered her arms and stared at Monty in confusion. After everything she had seen, making food indoors vanish, producing portals, electricity, and freezing water, all of that was the doing of an apprentice? "You're an apprentice?" she whispered in awe. However, her meaning was lost on Monty, as he took immediate offense, and his face tightened bitterly. "Don't let that master's ring he handed to you fool you," Nicholas continued, an obvious grin tugging at his lips. "That belonged to his master. Mr. Ronan hasn't even taken his final trials yet." Bristling, Monty rolled his eyes and folded his arms over his chest. "And that's the best thanks you can muster for how often I face death bringing your precious message to St. Emile." "Ah, yes, that message," Nicholas said in utmost calm. He turned to Andrea, and his smile softened. "My dear, do you like ice cream?" It's been so long." He pointed his wand at her lap, and a ceramic bowl popped into existence. With a second flick, she felt a chill as a ribbon of frost extended from it that solidified into perfect scoops of multicolored ice cream. She blinked in surprise and mumbled out a polite thanks. While magic food was quite impressive to the eyes, it tended to have a strangely hollow taste to it. It was difficult to describe, almost as though someone aware of how to cook food chose to find ingredients that only reminded of the real thing. However, she was not one to be rude, so she smiled and took hold of the spoon that rested in the bowl and began to indulge herself. All in all, it was not bad. Saccharine, difficult to place in flavor, but quite pleasant. "Mr. Ronan tells me he met you last night, Andrea." "Mm-hmm," she mumbled in mid-bite. He thinned his eyes as he looked down on her, intrigued. "I must ask, how did you get that scroll case open?" It was trapped. Fearing she was soon going to be in a lot of trouble, she shrugged gently and stared into the bowl. It had a mechanism to it. I was just trying to see who to return it to, so I opened it." She glanced up and saw him arch an eyebrow at her. Flatly, he informed her, "It should have killed you." The spoonful of ice cream she had been about to eat slid back into the bowl with a plap. She gawked at him, slack-jawed in the most undignified way possible. "And yet here you are," Nicholas noted with a grin. "Clearly our men in the Mechanics Guild didn't count on you. And I believe I earned the right to tell your mother I told you, though I am a much wiser man than to do so. And Mr. Ronan," he changed subjects before Andrea could ask what he had meant, "since you were so very diligent in bringing that message here." Slowly, Monty sat lower in the seat and stared at the floor. "Why didn't you bring it directly here last night?" Monty coughed softly. Above him, Pascal shook out his feathers as though sharing his master's discomfort. "Please, apprentice, enlighten me," Nicholas said, his voice dropping by degrees. "After he began in a low mumble, "got it back from Miss Corsair. I read it." "Mm-hmm." "And the damn thing didn't say anything important," he rushed out defensively. "I risked so much for so little, and I'd be tossed in the pits if I didn't get to have a full night's sleep and a decent meal for the first time in months." "Your honesty is so refreshing." "Of course you deserved that much," Nicholas said in a low growl, clearly unamused. "Though if you had done your one job last night, the unpleasantness today would have been avoided," he said coldly, waving a hand as he turned his back on him. The young mage slumped in the chair, rubbing his upper arm shamefully. "Sorry, sir." "More than that, I could have told you then." As he paused, he produced the message from his waistcoat pocket. He held up the curled paper for both to see. "This wasn't the message. This paper is worthless." Both Andrea and Monty stared at him in surprise, and deliberately Nicholas leveled his eyes with Andrea. "However, thank goodness, the message is safe. Miss Andrea has it." Oh dear, she was in trouble. But no! I gave it back to him. I swear, there was nothing I left out. Nicholas shook his head and held up his hands. Calm down, calm down. The message was magic. Andrea's stammering ceased when Monty spoke, and she turned her eyes to face him. The young man was sitting straight in the chair, his eyes distant in thought. "Yes," Nicholas said calmly, "you are correct." Monty leaned forward and propped his elbow on his knee, cradling his forehead against his hand. That message was magic. A magic Master Ferris gave his life protecting, Nicholas affirmed. He turned back to Andrea, and she stared up at him, dumbfounded. There was something she had never seen in the man, a rigid severity that was so unlike him.
Andrea, while you did nothing wrong, the contents of that message were from my eyes alone. I serve House Ventaris as Court Magus, and our Lord Emperor as head of arcane intelligence.
The information struck Andrea hard. She felt herself sitting up straighter. Even knowing his place in court, she had never once taken the man seriously. He was very serious now, and it made him seem so much a stranger to her. She honestly knew nothing, and it suddenly frightened her.
A treaty long ago forbids magic users to fight in times of war directly. Monty clarified. The Treaty of Dorsai. You'll speak again when I ask it, apprentice, Nicholas said harshly. However, we serve indirectly, most excellently, as gatherers of intelligence. The information you read was magically encoded to minuscule size, easily transportable, and hidden in an innocuous message should it be intercepted. I was to read it and gain the real knowledge, then extract it. A sinking feeling filled her stomach, threatening to tangle with the ice cream at any moment.
But that means...
Firmly, he placed a fingertip on her forehead. It means that because you were unharmed by the trap and were able to read it first, the information, Miss Corsair, is now in your head.
She pushed back from his hand, nearly toppling backwards off the bed. But I didn't mean... His face softened, and in an instant the man she knew returned. He smiled wearily and held up his hands.
Now, don't fret. In all honesty, something like this happening was never considered an impossibility. It was encoded as such for a reason. And look, who has it is right here, and not an enemy.
But this certainly wasn't planned on, Monty scoffed, and it's definitely not favorable.
So says the apprentice with slippery fingers.
Ah, good. A new voice announced itself. The lady is awake. Andrea started. Goodness, the last several days had made her jumpy, and faced the doorway to see the source of this new voice. A man in Garlish military uniform stood just in the door, his back straight and his shoulders squared. Precisely trimmed, chestnut hair slicked back, his face steadfast and lined despite his not reaching middle age. Undoubtedly from the heavy weight of responsibility, Andrea was immediately reminded of how strange a picture mages made against men of consequence, the officer making Nicholas and Monty's appearances all the more garish and disheveled respectively. "Let us get this over with, shall we?" he said firmly, looking to Nicholas. Nicholas visibly bristled, and he cleared his throat softly. "Captain, I explained this." The captain stiffly strode into the room, and he leaned over where Andrea sat. "Young miss, Captain Rivers, Master Nicholas explained the situation to me." Under the man's gaze, Andrea shrank by degrees. The man was staring directly in her face, and yet it were as though he saw nothing. "It will only take a short time to remove the intelligence from you, and then you'll be free to return to your family," Rivers continued. "Captain!" Nicholas said louder. Rivers' dignified calm faltered as he straightened and locked eyes with him. "By the divine what, Magus?"
"How dare you attempt to go over my head when I made my orders clear?"
The man in uniform stood extremely close to him, making Nicholas's height more obvious, yet his bearing more powerful. He attempted to whisper, but it was truly only the barest of attempts. She and Monty could hear him clearly.
"I will remind you men on the front are dying as you tiptoe around a single girl.
And I will remind you that in matters of intelligence I am your superior, Captain." The two men eyed each other, but Rivers finally stood down. He turned sharply on his heels and let out a grunt of frustration as he went back to the door. "You will bear the burden of this choice, Magus. It's much easier than it looks," Nicholas called after him as he stormed down the hall. He leaned back in the room, sighing heavily and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Monty stood sharply, tilting his head slightly to look into Nicholas's face. "Master?" What was... Andrea chimed in. Nicholas turned back to them, a tired smile on his face. "Pay no mind to the good captain." "What was he talking about? Is there a way to remove the information now?" Monty pressed. Uneasily, Andrea shifted on the edge of the bed and tapped her spoon on the lip of the bowl. If there's something I need to do." Reassuringly, his smile deepened, and he pointed his wand at the bowl. The ice cream that had nearly melted refroze, and he chuckled lightly. "Pay no mind, Miss Andrea. Wait here and finish your ice cream, With that, Nicholas left the room, and Monty glanced at her. He paused a moment, then jogged out of the room after the master mage.
Wearily, Andrea sighed and looked at Pascal and Archibald. The hawk craned its head for a moment, then began to preen idly, whereas the snake only slept indifferently. It seemed the three of them were equally privy to anything pertaining to her fate. The ice cream was starting to taste bitter. Monty Ronan rushed to catch up with Master Nikolos's long strides. Although the man went by Master, he was drastically unlike any other Master journeyman that Monty had ever known. He took no students. He rarely reported to the journeymen or to universities. He languished among the upper classes. If rumor was to be true, then he spent more time around women than anyone in his profession. Despite all of this, Monty's teacher, Master Ferris, had spoken of Nikolos in nothing but the most respectful of words, and defended Nikolos if any other mage spoke ill of him. He had assured Monty that there was no one within the ranks of espionage in service to the Emperor who was more dedicated to the task. Even though Monty would have gladly given his own life for Ferris, in the few times he had met Nikolos, it was still difficult to trust his master's word. "Nikolos!" Monty called out as he neared. He didn't pause as he walked through the hall. "Oh, please, apprentice, do tell me your concerns." There. That. The fact that Nikolos was announcing his rank at every available turn, as though the fact negated all of his work and skill. Habits like that made it so infuriating to be around him. Monty forced himself to take a long breath and let it out deliberately. He wouldn't get angry and make a scene in the middle of a guardhouse. The uniformed men they passed would most likely not take to it well. He began steadily, how exactly can anything be removed from that girl's head? What was Rivers talking about? I've never heard of this kind of magic before. This entire method of message relay sounds impossible. Nikolos's lips tightened briefly. It is extremely rare, that's why. Years of research were required to perfect a version of the spells. Those of us crafting it never considered we would have to use it in a war against the territories of his own origins. This was a surprise. Monty knew little about the Northern Orders, and now that he thought on it, he had heard next to nothing about them during his school years. The exotic arts of Khitan and their use of paper over wands, the forbidden magics of Tenetcher to the west, and the powders that could cloud the mind, these he had learned of, at least in theory. He could never perform either, of course, but shrouded in mystery and secrecy were the orders beyond the northern countries. Supposedly, they followed the same schools of incantation as the journeymen, but rumor had it that any who left the territories of the order were sworn to secrecy. Secrecy so severe that somehow breaking the vows would immediately be known and punished absolutely. Seeming to guess Monty's train of thought, Nikolos added, "It has been a long road to create an approximation of their magics. We, including your master, had to craft based solely on legend and hearsay. As an experiment, this could have gone much better," he grumbled. "If you know the magics, then why are you hesitant?" Worry was an odd look on the ordinarily smug Nikolos's face. "No. I prepared my own mind for the incantations, but not once have I ever performed such magics on another person." Nikolos slowed as they neared one of the communication rooms. As identification, he pulled out a medal bearing the seal of the Emperor's espionage regiment, a serpent coiling through an eye. He asked to use one of the ether emitters once a terminal was free. The technology was so new, Monty had only seen it once or twice in officers' tents near the front. From what he heard, it could carry sound over the ether, and a recipient at another terminal could pick up said sounds. For the moment, very little could travel. The most clear was code done in clicks. It all seemed suspect to Monty, but the military trusted it. "Straight away, sir," the soldier at the door affirmed, snapping to attention. Seeing ranks defer to Nikolos was outright unsettling. "You helped craft the spells," Monty continued as they waited. Nikolos was growing agitated. "And Master Beckett is leagues better than myself at extraction. If I decide to test my ability on Miss Corsair, there is a very real chance I will instead destroy her mind." Monty grimaced at the thought. And while our civil-minded Captain Rivers, and undoubtedly many others of rank, would be pleased to risk sacrificing her for the good of the Empire, he sighed, "she and her family are friends to me." The soldier reappeared in the doorway. "Sir, step inside. A terminal is ready for you. The young man will have to wait." Before disappearing into the room, Nikolos looked to Monty. "And I will not explain to Adolfo Corsair how the combined incompetence of the Mages Guild students and masters robbed him of a child." Monty gawked at Nikolos and took several steps back from the door. Incompetence. Yes, that was the best way to describe it.
Andrea sat idly on the edge of the bed, tapping her heels on the floorboards. Several minutes had gone by with her having no human company, and Pascal's repeated looks in her direction were not exactly riveting conversation. The snake had woken up and was now climbing the chair Monty had been sitting in, making her stay in the room increasingly uncomfortable. As it coiled around the back and its tongue poked out, Andrea shuddered in disgust and jumped to her feet. Being even this far away from it was far too close. She eased in the doorway and glanced down the hall, currently seeing no one moving through it, though catching snippets of conversation of one matter military or another from the various rooms. She then turned the other way, and nearly started in surprise. A woman was leaning against the wall near the door of the infirmary, and she turned to Andrea with a wry smile. "Now, I'm quite sure the spy master told you to stay put." Everything about this woman left Andrea speechless. She wore drab gray pants and tan calf-high riding boots, and a long green waistcoat over a dark shirt, allowing anyone to see the shape of her figure plainly. As she pushed away from the wall, she moved and grinned with an unshakable confidence Andrea was unused to seeing on anyone other than men. More than any of this, however, was the combination of her jet-black hair tied up and a pair of extremely slender, impenetrable brown eyes. She was Khitanese. Andrea had never seen anyone from Khitan other than once or twice as travelers at festivals. She had certainly never spoken to one. "So," the woman began as she slipped by Andrea into the room, "you were the one causing so much fuss outside, little bunny?" Sheepishly, Andrea held her hands behind her back, fumbling with any way to respond. How could anyone hope to seem polite when it was difficult not to stare? Thank goodness she didn't have an accent at all. "Shy, are we?" She finally covered the silence. "It must be a lot to take in, being considered vital intelligence and all." "And how are we, Archibald?" She cooed the snake. She actually pursed her lips at it, and it seemed to greet her gleefully with a flicking of its tongue. You're not afraid of that awful thing?" she mumbled. "Awful? You're not awful, Archibald," she assured the serpent, who was now slowly making its way up her arm. "He and I have grown used to each other. While I'm in St. Emile, I defer to Nicholas, after all." Then are you a mage or a spy?" She laughed lightly. "Neither. I'm a lady. A lady in breeches, dripping of bravado and cuddling snakes." Andrea was doubtful. Oh. "Ladies," Nicholas announced himself as he and Monty entered the room. "Matea, I see you've introduced yourself to Andrea." "Matea? Not something with Lee in it?" "In a way," Andrea mumbled. "Briefly," Matea clarified. Nicholas gently placed a hand on Andrea's shoulder. "Andrea, you'll have to be patient with us for just a while longer, all right?" She nodded feebly. All right." "I've just sent word to a colleague and friend in Port Ainsland," he explained calmly. "He's well versed in the magic needed to retrieve our intelligence. I've asked him to come to St. Emile straight away, and he'll perform the magic." He turned to Matea, and eagerly Archibald stretched from her shoulders to his. "Matea, I have a mission for you." Her demeanor immediately straightened, reminding Andrea much of the soldiers she had seen thus far. "Yes, sir." "Andrea needs someone to watch her until Master Beckett arrives." "Yes, sir." Uncomfortably, Andrea shifted her weight and stared at the floor. Nicholas's voice softened. Now, this nasty business will be over soon enough." "I'm so sorry I caused all this, Master Nicholas," she whimpered out. "Now stop that. The message wasn't intercepted by the enemy, or a civilian we would never find. It was you. All things considered, this was the best of any unexpected outcomes." Monty spoke up firmly. "Master Nicholas." He turned slightly. For a moment, he took a breath, then steadily spoke. "Matea would better serve in helping the city guard and hunting those Nurgovod agents." Nicholas raised an eyebrow, while Matea folded her arms. "Are you suggesting something?" he asked calmly. "Until that message is removed intact, I haven't completed my master's final mission," Monty said, though his voice wavered at the mention of his master. "Until Master Beckett arrives, let me guard Miss Corsair."
Corsair Clockworks is an Ever Tomorrow production, plot by Jessie Lynn Jones and Marlon de Rivera, and written and performed by Jessie Lynn Jones. For more audio fiction, click the links and subscribe today so you'll always be ready for the next chapter.